So, Game of Thrones Season 7 was not the best, and recently I was asked, okay, Hotshot, what would you have done to fix the whole thing? Actually, they didn't say hotshot, they said pedantic asshole, but you know, same same. So, okay, starting in the same place and ending roughly in the same place, this is Preston Season 7. So I'd start things off with Dany landing not on Dragonstone but in Dorne, which would honestly just make a crapload more sense. Why land a mass of people on a tiny island with no food? Dorne was right there, come on. You actually have to go by Dorne to get to Dragonstone. And if you're going to introduce the Dornish, as much as people hate them, you still need to utilize the Dornish. Currently, the Dornish have had no influence on the plot other than killing Myrcella, something that a flu could have done. Anyway, I'd have the initial conflict be the fact that Daenerys' crew doesn't get along at all, that they're barely functional. Most importantly, Tyrion and Ellaria can barely be in the same room together over the deaths of Myrcella and Oberyn. And Daenerys can barely stand Varys. Varys would attempt to claim that he's always been a Targaryen supporter plotting against Robert for her brother Viserys from the beginning, and he would assure Dany that she was never in danger from the poison in Season 1 since he knew Jorah would save her, and he would enigmatically say that there's a reason he shaves his head, and Illyria owned dragon eggs for a reason, and that his compatriot Quaithe helped her in Qarth, and that Targaryen loyalties are wide and go back many years. This is what he'd claim. This would help tie up a whole bunch of loose ends and better explain why Varys isn't killed. And then he would claim that Dany grew into something special that goes beyond house loyalty, and that he sees her as something great that can help the people, blah blah blah. And at that point, Dany would reluctantly let him live. So I would have Tyrion's battle plan be bold and direct. The Dornish, Reachers, and Dothraki would begin marching to King's Landing by land, while the Unsullied would first take the Stannis-held Dragonstone with the Ironborn fleet and set up a base of attack. The land and sea forces would then converge on King's Landing simultaneously, with Randall Tarley leading the Reachers, Olenna would use her best general, and Lady Nym leading the Dornish. We're utilizing the Dornish. Obara Sand would be suspiciously absent from these talks, and Kovaro would be leading the Dothraki. Yes, Kovaro would be back. Ago too. I'm not sure why these guys disappeared. Meanwhile at the Wall, I would have Bran arrive, though I ditched the whole robot Bran routine. Bran acting this way was never well established, and frankly makes him really unlikable. What I would add would be Bran seeing Hodor walking among the army of the dead. That would be an emotional punch in the gut. Meanwhile at Winterfell, I would have Littlefinger feed information to Sansa about how yes, Jon is now ruling Winterfell, but with Edmure Tully missing, Riverrun, her mother's home, is now technically hers. Not to mention Littlefinger would say he is the Lord of Harrenhal, and the Freys are weak with the death of Walder. The Riverlands are part of the Northern Kingdom, and Littlefinger would claim they need to be retaken. Sansa would mention this to Jon, but he claims no connection to the Riverlands or Catelyn, who hated him, and is only focused on arming his men in his fight against the Night King. And this would be the main conflict between Jon and Sansa, whether to avenge the Tullys and take the Riverlands, not the abstract fear of Cersei or whether Umber lands should be given away. What Jon wants to do is attack the last remnants of Stannis' army on Dragonstone to secure the Dragonglass there. Yes, he would of course know about the Dragonglass, since Sam found out about it already. Or we could have Davos tell Jon and make Davos a little more useful. The problem with taking Dragonstone, though, is the North doesn't really have a navy. Sneaky Littlefinger, though, would claim that there's actually caves of Dragonglass near Riverrun, and that he would explore these as a child, and that he can even draw them a map. The northern armies should march south to take Riverrun for its Dragonglass, Littlefinger would claim. Jon is highly suspicious, as marching south is coincidentally what Littlefinger wanted to do, but Sansa agrees to send Brienne and Pod on a mission to verify that these caves exist. Brienne would then make a snarky comment about how she just came from Riverrun. But in my story, Brienne would have something to do. In King's Landing, I would have Cersei and Jaime talk about their dire military situation. They would mention that they pinned the destruction of the Sept on Daenerys, and that they restored the old High Sept into his post, who has quelled the city a bit. For now, the Stormlanders and Riverlanders are with them to stop Targaryen restoration. You see, I'm working to close these plot holes. Playing off a Season 4 scene, Cersei would mention that Joffrey actually had anti-dragon ballistas built, and that her pyromancers have been working around the clock to produce more wildfire. Euron would arrive and say that part of his fleet is done and that more is on the way, since having his whole fleet finished would be stupid, and Euron would suggest a marriage alliance. Desperate, Cersei would accept, and the two would become betrothed, creating a little more tension between Jaime and Euron. Meanwhile in the Riverlands, Arya would be hiding at the Twins as a servant, still repeating her death list and generally gathering information. She would hear that the Freys are in chaos without Walder, and they would mention that tension exists between the Freys of the twins, Riverrun, and Harrenhal. Quite significantly, she would overhear that the Lannisters have taken Edmure Tully to Casterly Rock, and that the castle is held by none other than Ilyn Payne, who has been named Castellan. Arya heads off to Casterly Rock to rescue her uncle and cross another name off her death list. In Old Town, I would have Sam working hard at the Citadel. The montage would not be of shit, but would be of him studying, dissecting bodies, and tending ravens. After a quick scene with Gilly, I would have him head to the Quill and Tankard to meet his classmates. At a large gathering, his classmates would be talking about a man with grayscale named Jorah Mormont who arrived from the east. They would claim that he's been raving about dragons and how monsters have returned to the world. Sam would feel emboldened by this talk of monsters and would mention that he knew Jorah's father, and the two faced an army of the dead together. His classmates would laugh at him. Only one classmate would say that he believed him. We would pan over, and that classmate would be, shocker, Obara Sand. I would end the episode on Dragonstone with the Unsullied beginning their assault. Only they find the island oddly unguarded. They would secure the castle, and the final scene of the episode would be Dany and company entering the throne room and finding Melisandre and the remaining Stannis' men kneeling to their new queen. So for episode 2, I would have Dany and company preparing for their attack on King's Landing. I would have Melisandre tell Dany to hold off and seek Jon Snow because of prophecies and the army of the dead and all that mumbo-jumbo. Dany, though, would find the whole thing unbelievable, but she would tell Melisandre that she will contact Jon Snow and tell him to meet her in King's Landing after her quick and easy conquest of the city. In King's Landing, he can bend the knee. After Melisandre leaves, though, I would have Dany tell Missandei that Melisandre does concern her, especially after her vision of the wall in the House of the Undying, because frankly that vision deserves a callback. Missandei can then go and have her sex scene with Grey Worm. We can keep that in. Meanwhile in King's Landing, I would have Cersei and Jaime preparing for battle. Cersei would go to speak with Qyburn, who is surrounded by his little birds. Cersei would say that she has a very important message that needs to reach its destination swiftly and secretly, and that everything may depend on it. And Qyburn would say he would do his best. Meanwhile at Casterly Rock, I would have Arya infiltrating the castle, pretending to be a Lannister guard. She sneaks up to Ilyn Payne's quarters, where she murders him. He calls out the best he can with no tongue, and the guards arrive to find him dead and his murderer nowhere to be found. Arya is hiding. The guards go on high alert as Arya makes her way to where Edmure is being held. However, when Arya arrives, the guards have killed Edmure, Rosalind, and their child. Arya is furious and kills all but one guard, and asks the final one why they killed Edmure, and he'll say, "It was the Queen's orders. Kill the prisoners if anyone attacks the castle." Arya kills the last guard, and then repeats her death list again, starting with Cersei. Now wouldn't that be a more interesting adventure than Arya meets Ed Sheeran? Meanwhile in Old Town, Sam and Obara have become fast friends, and they go to see Jorah Mormont because of Sam's connection with his father. You see, in my story, their meeting wouldn't just be a big coincidence. Through the window, Jorah would explain that he's been imprisoned by the Citadel and left to die to ensure the safety of others. Sam and Obara steal some keys, sneak in and try to treat Jorah. However, after finishing the surgery on Jorah, the Maesters catch Sam and Obara, and the three are quarantined together to see if the grayscale returns. In my story, Jorah would take more than a day to heal. Meanwhile in Winterfell, the letter arrives from Dany telling Jon of the conquest of Dragonstone, and he is commanded to King's Landing to bend the knee, though he's undecided on whether he'll do it. So Jon begins a march south for at least as far as Moat Cailin to wait on Dany's conquest to see if she wins, but also for news from Brienne, and to see if he can contact House Reed, who potentially has thousands of men to fight. And of course, the minute Jon leaves, Littlefinger would complain to Sansa that Jon is now giving away everything they fought for. He would mention how the Targaryens killed her grandfather and her uncle, and how Rhaegar raped Lyanna, and would mention that her father worked hard to expel the Targaryens. In fact, he would mention that Cat and Ned's marriage was based on expelling Targaryens. Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, Brienne and Pod would stop at the Inn of the Kneeling Man, where they would run into Gendry. I mean, honestly, anywhere other than King's Landing makes sense for him. And of course, Gendry would remind Brienne of Renly. And they would all talk about how the Riverlands are now in chaos with the death of Walder Frey, with the different Frey factions fighting amongst themselves. Brienne would talk about the army of the dead briefly and the new King of the North's mission to fight them, and Gendry would appear somewhat inspired. Soon after leaving the inn, Brienne and Pod would find that Littlefinger's map is false. There is no Dragonglass Cave around Riverrun, and Littlefinger was lying. Brienne prepares to send a raven home warning Sansa, when Pod surprises everyone and murders Brienne in cold blood. Boom! Twist. Now yes, Brienne dying is a pretty big departure from season 7, but honestly, she's probably going to die next season sometime anyway, so we might as well have her die here in an interesting way. The episode would end with Dany sailing towards King's Landing with her fleet and her Unsullied. Dany flies with her dragon, though as they pass the island of Driftmark, Euron's fleet is hidden there for a sneak attack. Dany attempts to intervene, but a ballista fires from a ship and nearly hits Drogon, and so Dany panics and flees. Euron then utterly destroys Dany's fleet, killing all of the Unsullied and Grey Worm while capturing Yara. You see, in my version, it's partially Dany's fault for her military failure, giving her some serious guilt when it comes time to face Miss Sandy later about the death of Grey Worm. Theon wouldn't actually be with the fleet in my story. Theon, being a fine writer, would be over with the land armies. And speaking of those land armies, I would have Randyll Tarly and Lady Nym marching them towards King's Landing, and then I would have the Reachers and the Dornish begin marching in a pattern that surrounds the Dothraki. In a surprise, they would turn and attack them, betraying Dany. We would pan down to find that Qyburn's little birds had made it to Randyll Tarly and Lady Nym. Cersei's message made it to them. The Dothraki panic, with many dying and fleeing. Theon manages to escape with a band of Dothraki. For episode 3, I would have it open in King's Landing. I would have Euron arrive with Yara, but it would be Randyll Tarly and Lady Nym who would bring in Ellaria and Tyene, the betrayal of Lady Nym being an extra sting for them. Cersei would name Randyll Tarly the Lord of the Reach and Lady Nym the Lady of Dorne, giving them Highgarden and Sunspear respectively. The whole Cersei torture thing can be kept in, that was fine, and then Jaime would march off with Lady Nym and Randyll Tarly to take Highgarden. Meanwhile at Moat Cailin, Podrick Payne would arrive and tell Jon that the Freys murdered Brienne. He would demand that they take action against the Freys. Jon though says he can't afford to start another war and wonders if Brienne and Pod found the Dragonglass. Pod then lies and says that he and Brienne did find the cave and that they need to fight the Freys for it. Pod then encourages Jon to attack the Freys and get revenge against the men that killed his brother Robb. Jon is about to march south when Davos returns, having not found House Reed, but instead having found the Brotherhood Without Banners. They were trying to sneak into the north for some reason. The Brotherhood, though, also has news from the south. Daenerys was massively defeated at King's Landing. Realizing that he's in a much better position to treat with Dany, Jon decides to answer Dany's summons and head to Dragonstone. Pod feigns distress about this, but Jon quells his anger by agreeing to take him on as a squire with Brienne gone. Before leaving, Jon asks what the Brotherhood Without Banners was doing here and questions whether he should allow them north. The Brotherhood replies that they are taking the Black and heading to Eastwatch. Meanwhile on Dragonstone, Dany and Tyrion are sulking about their massive defeat, and Missandei is devastated about the loss of Grey Worm, and Dany feels guilty that it was her panicking that contributed to everything falling apart. Melisandre, though, tells her that the Lord of Light has given Dany hope, and she has received word from her compatriot Beric Dondarrion. Jon Snow is answering the summons, but coming not to King's Landing, but to Dragonstone. Dany would then wonder if any of her forces survived the betrayal of Randyll Tarly and Lady Nym. This would transition to Harrenhal in the Riverlands, where Frey soldiers are transporting grain into the open gates of the castle. The guards stop as they hear hoofbeats, but it's too late. Kovaro and the Dothraki are upon them before they have the opportunity to close the gates to the castle. Theon rides in afterwards and orders the captured maester to prepare a raven for Dragonstone. You see, in my story, Theon has something to do, and the Dothraki don't have to later teleport into the middle of the continent. Meanwhile in Old Town, Jorah, Sam, and Obara are quarantined together. Sam tells the story of the army of the dead north of the Wall and how he saw them with Jorah's father. The story of Sam's sacrifice inspires Jorah. He vows that he will do whatever he can to help Sam and the fight against the Night King. Obara decides to reveal to them that she's really a woman and that she will fight with them as well. The three are declared healthy, but Obara and Sam are expelled from the Citadel. Obara then reveals that there was a reason she came to the Citadel in the first place. She was looking for a tome called Fire and Blood. Her father Oberyn told her that it contains some of the oldest histories and the darkest magics. With Daenerys coming to Westeros with her dragons, Obara thought the book might be useful. Sam says that he knows where the tome is, but that it's in the restricted section. So that night, the three sneak back into the Citadel, steal keys, and grab the tome. Meanwhile at Winterfell, I would have Bran arrive. Sansa would tell Bran that Jon is at Moat Cailin trying to find House Reed, and Meera would note that the castle moves and they won't find it without her help. Bran says that he has something he needs to tell Jon, and so Bran and Meera plan to head to Moat Cailin to find him. Before Bran departs, Littlefinger would present Bran with the dagger that nearly killed him. Bran and Sansa would discuss the dagger a bit, and Bran would say that even in his visions, he has not yet determined who hired the catspaw. Bran, though, would mention that he once did see his parents discuss a letter from Lysa, and that it was Lysa who told Catelyn that the Lannisters killed Jon Arryn, and that it's this that sent their father south to King's Landing in the first place. This information would give Sansa some pause, and she would walk off to mull everything over. There would be no scene of Bran telling Sansa that she looked pretty the night she was raped. The episode would end at Highgarden with Jaime Randall and Lady Nym taking the castle. Jaime would meet Olenna and explain that Randyll Tarly made the assault an easy victory, as he knows every castle in the Reach, and they had most of the Reacher forces under their control anyway. Highgarden never really stood a chance. This would be a much better explanation for the Lannister win, rather than the Tyrells having a rose for their sigil. And we can keep the Olenna suicide scene in, as it was a pretty strong way to end the episode. And so I would push back Jon arriving on Dragonstone until episode 4. Jon would arrive on the island with Podrick, his new squire, who was secretly working for Littlefinger. Tyrion and Jon would meet and they would reminisce a bit before Tyrion asks Jon how he feels about no longer being in the Night's Watch. Jon would say that yes, some see him as a deserter, but in a way, he has never left the Night's Watch. He is still guarding the realms of men against the threat north of the Wall. He simply has more power to do that as King in the North than as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Tyrion would say that Melisandre has already told them about this supposed army of the dead, and Jon would become furious that Mel is still lingering in Westeros. Tyrion would then mention that Mel quite suddenly left for Essos before Jon arrived. Jon would mention that he has no tolerance for people that burn innocents, and that would lead to awkward silence from Tyrion. When Jon meets Dany, Dany would request that Jon kneel, but Jon would point out that she is in no position to make demands, as her armies have now turned on her. She needs Jon, and he is willing to join her, even kneel to her, if he gets the dragon glass on the island, and she uses her dragons to fight the army of the dead. Dany would think Jon too bold, and she would tell Jon that she still in fact has an army. A raven informed her that the Dothraki have taken Harrenhal, and she is well positioned to take other castles in the Riverlands like Derry and Riverrun. Pod would butt in and say that the Riverlands are part of the Northern Kingdom, and that Harrenhal belongs to House Baelish and Riverrun to Sansa Stark. Jon of course would shush him, and Dany would point out that the Freys seem to control most of the Riverlands and not the Northern Kingdom. Jon would then say that this is not the time for bickering, and he would re-emphasize that an army of the dead is marching on the Seven Kingdoms. Dany would point out that the king in the north knelt to Aegon the Conqueror, and Jon would point out that Dany's father killed his grandfather and uncle, and that her brother Rhaegar raped his aunt. This would enrage Dany, who says she can forgive the comments about her father, but she would not have him slander her brother. Dany would then throw Jon and Pod into the dungeons. After this action, Tyrion and Varys would warn Dany that throwing a king in a cell is not a smart move, and she is in a poor position to be making enemies. Dany then says it's time to put herself into a better position, and to prepare a raven for Harrenhal. In King's Landing, we would have Cersei meeting with the Iron Bank, vowing to pay them when her army returns with the gold from Highgarden, and I would keep in that she's using her newfound wealth to hire the Golden Company. In the Reach, we'd have Jaime returning with the Tyrell gold, and he would speak with Randyll Tarly, who mentions that Dany's Dothraki did take Harrenhal and are now using it as a base of attack. A conflict with them may be likely. Jaime asks if the Dothraki are strong enough to defeat them, and Randyll would assure them that they outnumber the Dothraki nearly 3-1. Jaime agrees to keep on marching to King's Landing. Meanwhile in the Riverlands, I would have Arya arrive at the inn at the crossroads on her way to King's Landing to kill Cersei. She would find Hot Pie, who updates her on everything. He would say that the world has really gone crazy. Walder Frey has died, and that the Freys of Riverrun and the Twins may go to war. He would mention that the Dothraki of all people have reinstalled the Ironborn at Harrenhal. Harren the Black is back, people say, and Daenerys Targaryen blew up the Great Sept, but failed to take King's Landing. Everyone is really rallying around Queen Cersei. Hot Pie would wonder why Arya is not at Winterfell, and Arya would say that she heard that the Vale armies conquered Winterfell. Hot Pie would say yes, they did, but they installed Jon as king in the north. Arya would then thank Hot Pie, change directions, and head north. In Winterfell, Littlefinger would tell Sansa that various ravens have arrived. He mentions that his seat in Harrenhal has been taken by Daenerys, a possible act of war. Sansa would comment that the Freys held the castle before, so it doesn't really count, and Littlefinger would suggest that perhaps the Freys have aligned themselves with Daenerys, though Sansa dismisses that. Littlefinger would then say that there's more. His spies on Dragonstone tell him that Jon and Podrick traveled to Dragonstone and have now been imprisoned by Daenerys. Sansa would ask, "You have spies with Daenerys?" And Littlefinger would say he has spies in most places. Sansa would ask where Brienne is, and Littlefinger would repeat the lie that she was murdered by the Freys. Sansa would then order that a raven be sent to Davos at Moat Cailin. Prepare the men to march south. Finally, in the Riverlands, Jaime would get a message that the gold has arrived in King's Landing, but that his scouts alert him that the Dothraki are marching south to meet them in the field. And so Jaime would prepare his men for the coming attack, and we would have the big Dothraki Lannister battle with Dany coming in. I would keep the battle mostly the same, except I wouldn't have Tyrion be there because warping him out there is rather silly. Instead of having Tyrion overlooking everything and being sickened by the violence, it can be Theon. And I don't really see the need for Bronn's boss battle that he had, and I wouldn't have Bronn handling the ballista. I mean, we can have a random soldier doing that. Why would a commander be operating a ballista anyway? I mean, people specialize in those sorts of activities. Anyway, I would keep Drogon getting hit, but when Jaime grabs his spear to finish off Dany, I would have it ripped from his hands by Bronn, who tells him that cripples can't joust. I would then have Bronn try to kill Dany and have him burned to death. After watching Bronn die horrifically, I would end the episode with Jaime yelling, "Retreat, retreat," and riding to King's Landing as fast as he can. And I wouldn't have any soldiers falling into rivers with armor on and surviving. Jon imprisoned, the North about to go to war, Obara doing things? How will my fanfiction all end? Well, we'll finish this up in part 2.